If your business runs on 5 different apps, 12 browser tabs, and one spreadsheet that everyone's afraid to touch, it's probably time for Odoo. Odoo is an all-in-one business management software that connects every part of your business into one powerful, easy-to-use platform. So instead of wasting time switching between disconnected systems, your entire business works together in real time. Your team moves faster, your data stays accurate, and you can actually focus on growing your business. Let one unified system run your entire business. From the first opportunity to the final payment, everything works together in one place. Whether you're a small business or managing a large operation, Odoo gives you the flexible platform built to grow with you. Try it today for free at odoo.com. That's ODOO.com.
This is the Station for Negotiation podcast, episode number 64. My name is Gene Killian. I've been a lawyer and professional negotiator for 40 years. On the evening of June 17th, 2026, the President of the United States sat down to dinner at the famous Palace of Versailles outside of Paris. Across the table was the President of France, Emmanuel Macron. There was pomp and circumstance, there were chandeliers, gold leaf, and the famous Hall of Mirrors, which was just a few doors down from where the two leaders were having dinner. And somewhere between courses of that dinner, President Trump signed a document that was aimed at ending the ongoing war with Iran. And that document, as I sit here today, has now been a total failure. Now, when he signed the document, there was supposed to be a much bigger ceremony. It was supposed to be in Switzerland with cameras and lots of media and a handshake for the American voter that said the war is over, everything's good. But quietly, the signing got moved up and slipped into the middle of a state dinner in France. One journalist, Julia Ioffe at Puck.com, called it a surrender. She pointed out that Versailles, ironically, is the building where they signed the treaty that ended one incredibly ruinous war in 1919, and in doing so helped set the stage for a far worse one 20 years later. Now that's a devastating image, but it might be the wrong lesson. Or at least it's too easy. And so today I want to take a look at the currently failed negotiation between the United States and Iran as a student of negotiation. Not looking at politics, not looking at the military side of this, just looking at this as negotiators. And I want to see if we can take some lessons away from it. And I'm going to focus in 3 areas. But before I do, let's set up the board, so to speak. This war started in late February 2026 with United States and Israeli airstrikes on Iran following the collapse of earlier talks with Iran. The stated goals of the air war were expansive and a little bit fluid. I'm not sure they were perfectly clear. There was talk about toppling the regime in Iran, which, let me tell you, most of the world would love to have that happen, especially the Gulf states. Iran has been a destabilizing influence in that area of the world and has financed Hamas and Hezbollah and other terrorist activities in the area. There was also talk about ending Iran's nuclear program, about draining Iran's missile stockpile, or some combination of all of the above. And Trump's own framing was maximalist. He kept talking about surrender, unconditional surrender. But of course, it didn't end that way. After about 5 weeks of fighting, there was a ceasefire in early April 2026. And then the war kind of congealed into something slower and stranger. A standoff over a stretch of water that I'm sure you've heard about over and over if you pay attention to the news. The Strait of Hormuz, which is a waterway in the Middle East, on the north coast of which lies Iran. On June 17th, President Trump and Iranian President Pezeshkian signed remotely what was called a Memorandum of Understanding. Mike Baker at the President Daily Briefing, which is a great podcast if you're interested in international politics, calls it a Memorandum of Misunderstanding, which I love. So I'm going to call it a Memorandum of Misunderstanding because that's what it turned out to be. This memorandum was brokered mainly by Pakistan, with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt involved in the negotiation, and it contains 14 points. So like Woodrow Wilson and his many points, any kind of international memo involving the United States seems to involve points. So this one had 14. Vice President Vance described the memo as a very general document, and that's an understatement. The important point is that the Memorandum of Misunderstanding did not end the war on its merits. It just declared a ceasefire and a 60-day clock to negotiate an actual deal. And it kicked all of the hard questions down the road. The nuclear program, verification as to whether the nuclear program was headed towards weapons, who controls the Strait of Hormuz, kicked all that down the road. So this Memorandum of Understanding is quite literally an agreement to reach an agreement. Now, those are the facts that everybody shares. And I want to focus now on kind of three areas that are relevant to all of us as negotiators. And the first thing I want to focus on is a question that you should consistently be asking yourself in any negotiation. How good is your intelligence? How good is the information you have? So before making any strategic move in a discussion, a business discussion or negotiation, you should constantly be striving to make sure you have the best facts available. And you should be asking yourself, what can we do to improve the scope of facts we have under our command? The quality of your information doesn't just help you at the table. It helps you decide, in this instance, whether you should be at war at all in the first place. The premise for the war was that Iran was racing to develop a nuclear weapon. And we know that the Israeli government has lobbied many presidents over the years about the fact that Iran needs to be neutralized. But let's take a look at what the public record actually supports here. And here's where this gets a little bit uncomfortable, because the honest answer is it depends entirely on whether you're measuring capability or intent, and those are two very different things. So when you're involved in a difficult negotiation and you're trying to figure out the other side's position, you should not only be looking at what they're capable of doing, but you should try to figure out what do they plan to actually do. Now, the capability side of this is alarming. Before inspectors lost access to Iranian nuclear sites, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, had verified that Iran was sitting on about 440 kilograms of uranium, which was enriched to 60%. Now, 60% sounds like it's a bit past halfway to weapons-grade material, which is about 90%, but it isn't. The enrichment process is front-loaded. So getting from 60% to 90% is a small fragment of the total work involved to getting to a nuclear weapon from raw natural uranium. The truth is that Iran had done about 99% of the work necessary to develop uranium sufficient to fuel a nuclear weapon. So that stockpile, if pushed to weapons-grade uranium, constituted enough material for something on the order of 9 crude weapons. And the technical breakout, just the enrichment step, was now measured in weeks and by some estimates days for the first batch. Very short breakout time. So if your question is, can they develop a nuclear weapon? The answer was absolutely, positively, yes. But you need to look at the intent side, which is a totally different picture. It's not can they, but are they? And on intent, the U.S. intelligence community's assessment said something that the war's framing sort of skipped over, that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, and that the supreme leader of Iran had not reauthorized the weapons program that had been suspended back in 2003. The IAEA, for its part, has said that Iran doesn't yet have a workable weapon design or a proven detonation system. So, as far as capability, yeah, Iran is capable of developing a nuclear weapon. As far as intent, doubtful. Doubtful at this point. Although now that we have this war going on, that assessment may change. So which number do you go to war over? That's the whole question, because a 60% enriched stockpile has a second life. It's not only a bomb, but its second life is as a message. It is leverage. In fact, Iran's own foreign minister floated diluting the enrichment of the nuclear material and said that would be a big concession. But the fact that he mentioned it means it's on the table. And you don't offer to give away something you're about to use. You offer to give away something whose entire value consisted of you might use it, a negotiating chip. Now, I want to be fair to the hawks here because we have to be even-handed. There is a very serious argument made by very serious analysts that Iran blew way past any amount of 60% material that a mere bargaining chip would require. They believe you don't stockpile hundreds of kilograms to make a point. You stockpile it to be ready. And once the inspectors were gone, and the cameras have been off since early 2026, nobody outside of Iran could actually verify which story was true. That uncertainty is real. And it's not paranoia, and it's compounded by the fact that we don't really know, or we don't appear to know, who we're actually dealing with in Iran. Iran is often thought of as a theocracy, a police state theocracy. But it's not clear how much power the current Ayatollah has, especially since he's basically disappeared from view. And there are some moderates inside Iran who want to end this war. We know that. But there are also hawks. And those hawks are largely in the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, the IRGC, who appear to be actually running the country. But let's sit with this for just a moment. If you're a negotiator, your nightmare isn't necessarily that you have bad intelligence. Your real nightmare is if you have ambiguous intelligence, some kind of data that supports two opposite theories of how your counterpart is going to behave. And I think we could argue legitimately that the mistake that this war made was collapsing ambiguity into certainty because certainty would justify a bombing campaign. It's plausible, it's arguable that the U.S. went to war against a capability and told the public that it was an intent. So let's go to our negotiator's notebook. Lesson number 1 for today. When you're looking at the other side, you're trying to figure out what their actions are going to be. You must separate capability from intent. Never let one masquerade as the other. Your counterpart's capacity to hurt you is not the same as a plan to hurt you. Intelligence that measures one and reports the other is how you end up in a fight that you didn't necessarily need. So before you escalate in a business negotiation or any kind of negotiation, ask yourself, am I reacting to what they can do, or am I reacting to verified evidence of what they actually intend to do? And notice when a capability is being displayed rather than used. Because if it's only being displayed, it might be a threat that the other side just means you to see to develop some leverage. I mean, this happens in business negotiations all the time. So the other side will forward you a complaint and tell you that they plan to file it in court if you don't agree with them. Do they actually intend to litigate, or are they only threatening litigation in order to get a leg up in a negotiation? These are questions you have to constantly ask yourself. So that's the first lesson. Separate capability from intent. Ask yourself, how good is our intelligence? Second point, whenever you're involved in negotiation, ask yourself where the real leverage is. Where is the leverage actually sitting in this scenario? Because in this Iran-US war, it appears to me that everybody assumed they knew where the leverage was, but they might have been looking in the wrong direction. Listen, Iran is not going to beat the U.S. military in a war. And we see, now that the war has rekindled itself, that American air power can basically hit anywhere in Iran whenever it wants. They can't stop the U.S. military. But they don't have to, is the point. All they have to do is drag this out as long as possible until the American public really gets sick of it. And in that way, they're going to get what they want. That's how the Iranians are thinking. And there's good reason to think that. There's a history of that happening in the U.S., in United States politics. So the American theory of leverage was, let's drop bombs on them, shock and awe, overwhelming force. We'll hit their facilities, we'll degrade their military, and then we'll dictate terms. And that's a perfectly good theory, I guess, against a country whose only asset is the thing that you're actually bombing. But here, the strikes that dented the nuclear infrastructure and that continue to do so can't touch the one card that actually is causing a problem. Iran's leverage isn't in their underground military facilities. It is floating in water in the Strait of Hormuz, which is a choke point that roughly a fifth of the world's oil has to squeeze through every single day. I want to emphasize, when you look at this as a negotiator, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, doesn't have to win a naval battle. They just have to convince people that the strait is unsafe to transit, disrupt traffic, and the oil prices go up in the West. When the oil prices go up in the West, gas prices in the United States climb in an election year. With congressional midterms coming up in November, this is a problem. So the pressure that Iran could apply doesn't really land on the Pentagon. It lands on the president's domestic hopes. And here's what proves who held the leverage. Every time a deal to end this conflict looked plausible, the stock market jumped. The market was pricing the war's end as good news because the war's continuation through the Strait of Hormuz was an economic tax on every American driver. So I want to emphasize, when you look at this objectively, Iran does not and did not need to beat the U.S. militarily. It needed to make the status quo expensive enough at exactly the wrong moment on the calendar that the other side wanted out. And this connects to a principle we built on a previous episode about baseball and the upcoming lockout. Whoever picks the moment picks who bleeds. Iran didn't control the battlefield. It controlled the timing of economic pain, and it aimed that timing and continues to do so at a November election. And that is real leverage. Bombs are allowed, but the Strait of Hormuz, I think, is decisive. So here's a lesson for the rest of us who will never have to negotiate a ceasefire. The loudest source of pressure in the room is almost never the real one. Real leverage is whatever lets you impose a cost your counterpart can't absorb on a clock they don't control. If you can find that, you have found the actual pressure point that will win the negotiation, no matter where everyone else is looking. My first negotiation teacher at the University of Michigan, J.J. White, used to say negotiation is the process of imposing costs on the other side until they do what you want. It's a hard idea, a hard way to look at negotiation, but boy, it's true a lot of the time. So, lesson number 2 from our negotiator's notebook. Leverage is a cost you can impose on a timeline the other side can't reset. Don't confuse your most visible strength with your most useful one. The U.S. has unmatched force and is still eventually going to have to negotiate a resolution here because Iran has a smaller lever attached to a bigger nerve, global oil prices tied to a domestic election clock. In any negotiation, ask yourself, what can I make expensive for the other side, and can I make it expensive right when they can least afford it? That intersection, cost plus timing, is where leverage lives, and it's frequently not where the power looks like it should be. So, very important to keep in mind. I wanted to take a sidestep here for a second, because back in 2015, the Obama administration negotiated a deal with Iran called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. The Trump administration canceled that deal in 2018, but let's briefly talk about what the JCPOA was and what it did, and it will help you see where we are in this negotiation, such as it is. The 2015 deal, the JCPOA, was long and specific, and it was built around one job. It made Iran cut its stockpile of enriched uranium by 97%, from 10,000 kilograms down to 300, and it capped further enrichment at 3.67%, which is enough to work in reactors to create energy and electricity, but it's useless for a nuclear weapon. It also closed Iran's path to plutonium, another fissile material used in nuclear weapons, by redesigning a major Iranian reactor so that spent fuel from that reactor couldn't yield weapons material. It bought a number you could measure. The whole point was to push Iran's breakout time, how long it would take to produce enough material for one weapon, out to at least a year, up from a few months. So it bought the Obama administration and the United States 1 year of warning. That was the product that the Obama administration was buying. But that's not even the important part. The important part was enforcement. And you know, we often talk about it's great to have a deal. The question is, how is it going to be implemented? And here the question is, how is it going to be enforced? Iran accepted the IAEA's protocol, which was intrusive, around-the-clock monitoring. And the whole thing was locked into a UN Security Council resolution that had a snapback trigger. If you cheat, we're going to reimpose crippling sanctions on Iran automatically. So this wasn't a handshake. It was a verified, enforceable commitment wrapped around physical limits you could inspect. And you know, we often talk about the tit-for-tat theory here, where if you're dealing with an aggressive negotiator, you must make proportional aggressive moves. And that's what this was. You had an aggressive negotiator in Iran, and the West and the IAEA came to them with the idea of a deal, but a lot of that deal created very strict enforcement. You know, people often complain that the Obama administration paid Iran money as part of that deal. Well, if you look into it, that was actually interest payments that the United States owed to Iran. It wasn't, it wasn't a buyout. It was money that was actually owed from the U.S. to Iran. The other thing is, under the 2015 deal, Iran shipped out 97% of its stockpile and then got some sanctions relief against a verified baseline. Now, if we're trusting the reporting we see in public, the Trump administration tried to start sending value to Iran, by unfreezing assets and so forth, while hard concessions were still unwritten. So, in my view, as a negotiator, that's bass-ackwards, right? You're paying before you have verified compliance. So, on one axis, both of these deals, the failed MOU and the JCPOA, have a glaring weakness. Neither one of them touched Iran's missile program, which is a major concern. So if you hear hawks criticizing the JCPOA, you have to give them that one point because it's fair. So why did the Trump administration kill the JCPOA in 2018? Well, there are three reasons. First, there was the sunset problem. The core enrichment limits weren't permanent. They would phase out over 10 to 15 years. And so the Israeli line of argument, Benjamin Netanyahu's line of argument, was that the restrictions would lift not by a change in Iran's behavior, but just by a change in the calendar. Second, the deal wasn't comprehensive. There were no limits on missiles, for example. And third, sanctions relief itself. Critics said that the Obama administration was handing Iran money that went straight to Hezbollah and Hamas, terrorist organizations. And the argument was that maximum pressure sanctions would force a better deal. The problem is that deal never came. Instead, Iran started breaching the caps and limits, and within a couple of years, its stockpile was more than 12 times the JCPOA limit, and its enrichment had climbed from 3.67% towards 20% and eventually to 60%. And that days-long breakout window is what set the stage for the current war. But here's the thing. The Trump administration walked away from the 2015 deal because it was too temporary and too narrow and too generous to Iran. But 8 years later, as a result of this war going on, President Trump has signed the MOU, which is even more temporary. It only buys a 60-day window as opposed to a potentially 15-year window. It's equally narrow, it's still silent on missiles, and it's arguably more generous up front, with relief moving to Iran before any verification of compliance. So it could be argued with some justification that we have traded a deal that gave a year of warning for a promise with no verification attached. And that's why, as one columnist put it, the Republicans who hated the Obama deal are suddenly sounding a little nostalgic for it. But let me be fair to the other side. A JCPOA critic might say, the sunset clauses always made it a delay and not a solution. And the 60% stockpile proves Iran's intent was never peaceful. So tearing it up just called Iran's bluff. And there is some force in that argument, but the rebuttal is pretty sharp. Every arms control deal has a sunset. The U.S. negotiators wanted 20 years, and Iran wanted 2 years, and they compromised. Walking away from a verified 1-year breakout margin, that is the amount of time it would take to develop enough enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon, in order to chase a permanent deal that has never materialized, is what has produced the situation we're in now. So that's where we are with respect to the cancellation of the JCPOA, which leads me to lesson 3 in today's Negotiators notebook. A verified temporary deal usually beats an unverified permanent promise. Never trade enforcement for aspiration. When you reject a concrete enforceable agreement because it isn't perfect or permanent, make sure the thing you're chasing actually exists. The 2015 deal bought a measurable, monitored 1-year margin, and walking away from that in pursuit of a better deal produced no deal at all, and eventually a war and a much vaguer agreement to agree. So in your own negotiations, remember, a signed, verifiable term you can enforce is worth much more than a broader promise that you hope holds. Perfect is the enemy of enforceable. Now, the last topic I want to talk about with respect to this deal is the concept of an agreement to agree, which is what the Memorandum of Understanding is. And listen, I have used agreements to agree frequently in my professional life. You get involved in a tricky negotiation, you're kind of at an impasse, and you say, well, you know what, let's sit down, let's make a deal list of the things we've agreed upon, let's make a list of the things we still have to negotiate about, and let's agree in good faith to try to negotiate resolution of the things we're still negotiating about. So the next topic I want to talk about is this. Is an agreement to agree a good strategy? Because that's what this Memorandum of Misunderstanding, as Mike Baker calls it, is. It didn't stop the nuclear question. It didn't settle who controls the strait. It stopped the shooting, started a 60-day clock, and promised to negotiate the hard stuff later. And a lot of people looked at that and sneered and said, that's not a deal. It's just a press release. I'm going to push back on that a little bit because sometimes an agreement to agree is the right instrument, even if it didn't work here. Let's take a look at the deal itself. When a conflict is hot and expensive, when every day of delay is measured in more missile strikes and higher oil prices, the single most valuable thing you can do is stop the bleeding and buy some time. And a framework, an agreement to agree, can do that. It can lock in cheap, reversible confidence building steps like a ceasefire, like lifting a blockade, like restoring some shipping, while deferring expensive, irreversible concessions until you're in a position to make them. It sequences the deal. You're doing the easy stuff first to create some momentum, and then you're going to deal with the hard stuff. That's kind of a textbook negotiation technique, and it's often wise. If the alternative to an imperfect framework is a continued shooting war, like here, having a framework, not such a terrible idea. So where did this one go wrong? This one went wrong because they left it incredibly vague on major points. A good framework is about the mechanism and flexible about the details. This one kind of flipped that. Let's look at the Strait of Hormuz. The MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, had Iran allowing safe passage with no charge for 60 days only. What does that mean? And what happens after that? So this left the door wide open for Iran to start charging ships to transit the waterway and just to call those fees instead of tolls. And the single most valuable thing the U.S. wanted, which was guaranteed freedom of negotiation through the strait, was left with a 60-day expiration date and a semantic loophole. So here we are. The other problem is, what does it mean that Iran's going to take steps to allow free passage through the strait? At some point, the U.S. Navy started escorting commercial ships on a southern route through the strait, which Iran said that's a violation of the MOU, and then the shooting started again because it wasn't clear enough on what does it mean that Iran is going to engage in best efforts to allow free transit through the strait. We had the same problem with the language relating to nuclear weapons. The document had Iran reiterate that it wouldn't seek a weapon. Reiterate, not verify, not dismantle, not submit to inspection, just restate a thing that it had always claimed to be true. In other words, take our word for it. The how do we check this question got shoved into the 60-day negotiations with no methodology locked in. And the leverage the U.S. was spending to get there, sanctions relief, unfreezing billions of dollars in assets, a $300 billion reconstruction fund, some of that started flowing before any of the hard terms were nailed down. Now remember the tit-for-tat theory of negotiation. If you start making concessions to an aggressive negotiator, they view it as weakness and they're going to keep pushing the envelope. That's kind of what happened here. And here's another rule that this violates. In a framework deal, an agreement to agree, you can defer a decision or you can defer a definition, but you can't do both. If you want to defer the decision, you can say, okay, we'll set the Hormuz transit regime in the final deal. We'll figure out how that's going to work in the final deal. We'll negotiate it. But then you'd have to define the fallback. And until we do, the following rules are binding. Right? That's the definition. But this MOU deferred both the decision and the fallback. They left the fallback vague, and they put a clock on the only protection that the deal contained. So that's a sure way to lose the point. My answer to, is an agreement to agree a good strategy, is yes, when you're disciplined about what stays open. An open framework with hard guardrails is a bridge to a permanent deal. But an open framework with soft guardrails is a trap It's a way to fall into the water. Here, the water of the Strait of Hormuz. So my next lesson for the Negotiator's Notebook today, in a framework deal, that is an agreement to agree, you can defer the decision or you can defer the definition, but you can never defer both on an important term. An agreement to agree is a legitimate and it's often a smart tool. It stops the bleeding and it sequences the rest of the negotiation. But it only holds if the terms you leave open are protected by a hard fallback in the interim. In other words, if you say, we're going to finalize X later, that's safe if it's paired with, until we do, Y is the binding rule. If you defer the decision, you have to pin the definition of what governs in the meantime. Never let your protection on the point you care most about carry an expiration date that the other side can simply wait out. There was nothing here in this Memorandum of Misunderstanding that gave Iran explicit consequences for if it just stalled. And that was a major problem with this deal. And here's one more problem before we close the loop. A negotiation is defined as much by who's not in the room as who is. Israel was not a party to these talks. And Israel had both the capability and the intention to keep engaging in military operations in Lebanon, which Iran did not want, regardless of what this document said. So you had a signed agreement that a powerful non-signatory did not agree to. And the MOU referenced what was going on in Lebanon in its ceasefire language. So Israel looked at this and said the U.S. is negotiating something away that they don't have a right to negotiate. And this is what I'll call the veto, V-E-T-O, veto player problem. And it's an under-respected force in any complex deal. You can get everyone at the table to say yes and still fail because the person who can kill the agreement wasn't at the table to begin with. A deal is only as durable as its treatment of the parties who can break it but didn't sign it. So it's tempting to make this whole failure a referendum on Donald Trump's deal-making vanity. There's a lot of that going on in the media. But a more accurate picture is multi-causal. You have ambiguous intelligence, you have misread leverage, you have a rushed framework, and you have a veto player left outside the deal. Assigning it all to one signature at one dinner may be satisfying, but it's incomplete. This failure had several authors. So let me just give you another lesson for today's Negotiator's Notebook. Always map out the players who can break a deal without signing it and bind them to the deal or figure out a way to price them into the deal. Consensus among the people at the table is not the same as durability. A non-signatory who has the power and will to act, whether it be a regulator or a board member or a coalition partner or an ally with an agenda, can screw up your agreement from outside it. So always identify who can veto this deal in practice before you sign, and either bring them in or build their likely behavior into the deal. If you ignore that, you have an agreement with a fuse, and you really don't need that. So let's go back to Versailles for a minute. The chandeliers, the dinner, and the quiet signature of the MOU between courses of the meal. The easy story is about the room. You had a showman, Donald Trump, who wanted a ceremony, he got a mess, and he hid the signing inside a dinner party. And you have the historical analogy, which is unbelievable, right there. This is taking place in the palace where World War I ended in a way that set the seeds for another way more destructive war. And that's a great analogy for political analysis. But the useful story isn't, to me, as a negotiator, in the dining room. It's in the areas we talked about today. the intelligence that measured what Iran could do and sold it as what Iran would do. The leverage that everyone thought was in the bombs, but was actually in the water of the Strait of Hormuz, timed to an election. And the agreement to agree. A legitimate tool, but this MOU did not have the discipline that could make it hold, and it deferred both the decision and the definition on the terms that mattered most, while a veto player outside the room had the ability to tank the whole thing. And here's the thing about the Versailles image. A treaty signed in a beautiful room can still be a terrible deal, and a framework scribbled on a page and a half in the middle of a dinner could in principle be a good one if the open terms had hard floors under them. Remember, whoever picks the moment picks who bleeds. Here, Iran picked the moment, and the question for the 60-day period that the MOU envisioned was whether anyone on the American side had picked adequate definitions of consequences. That is the difference between a bridge and a failure. I want to close with a quote from Sun Tzu in The Art of War. Always ponder and deliberate before you make a move. Let me read that one more time. Always ponder and deliberate before you make a move. And folks, that's all I have for you today. So this is Gene Killian for the Station for Negotiation signing off and reminding you once again that negotiation is life. Hey, thanks for listening to the Station for Negotiation podcast. Until next time, you can keep up with us on social media at the following places. On X, formerly known as Twitter, it's at STN4Negotiation. That's at STN4Negotiation. On Facebook, you can hit us up at facebook.com/station4negotiation pod. That's facebook.com/station4negotiation pod. Over on Instagram, you can reach us at station4negotiation. Again, that's at station4negotiation. On LinkedIn, station4negotiation podcast. Again, that's station4negotiation podcast. Over on YouTube, we're at station4negotiation. That's at station4negotiation. If you want to shoot us an email, you can do that at station4negotiationpod@gmail.com. That's station4negotiationpod@gmail.com. So we'll see you next time on the Station for Negotiation podcast. And until then, remember, negotiation is life.
Most people overpay for car insurance, not because they're careless, but because switching feels like too much hassle. That's why there's Jerry, your proactive insurance assistant. Jerry compares rates side by side from over 50 top insurers and helps you switch with ease. Jerry even tracks market rates and alerts you when it's best to shop. No spam calls, no hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Switch with confidence. Download the Jerry app or visit jerry.ai/Libsyn today. That's JERRY.ai/LIBSYN.